In this lesson, we're going to talk about authentication. Before we start, you should know the difference between identification and authentication because they aren't the same. Identification is the process of verifying the identity of a user requesting credentials. This process is also called identity proofing. It occurs during the identification phase. You prove that you are who you say you are in order to obtain credentials. Identity proofing is also used if you've been identified before, but you can't provide your assigned authentication credentials. For example, if you've forgotten your password. Authentication is proving that you are who you say you are by verifying the identification credentials provided. However, identification without authentication provides no security. Your networks and systems should require every user to complete the identification and authentication processes to gain access. Authentication can occur in one direction, like when you log into a system with a username and a password, or bidirectionally. Bidirectional authentication is called mutual authentication. This is when both the client and the server authenticate each other before exchanging data. Let's look at the 5 basic authentication factors. The first type of authentication requires the user to supply something known in order to authenticate. For example, the user might enter a username, a password, or a PIN number. This authentication factor is probably the most frequently used type. For example, when you log into a Windows workstation, you typically have to supply your username and password. And even though it's commonly used, Type 1 is also the least secure form of authentication because something you know is easy to transfer from person to person. For example, let's suppose a user writes their username and password on a sticky note and attaches it to their monitor. When they do this, somebody else can obtain those credentials and log into the system. The second authentication factor requires the user to supply something in their possession to authenticate. It's also sometimes called token-based authentication. Some examples include a digital certificate, a smart card, a security token on a key fob, or some type of USB security device. So here we have a user who needs to authenticate to a workstation. But notice that instead of supplying a username and a password, as we saw with Type 1, this user submits a security certificate to the system instead. If the security certificate is valid, then the user is allowed to authenticate to the system. Type 2 authentication is usually considered more secure than Type 1 because it's a little bit more difficult to transfer an item in the user's possession for authentication. For example, a properly secured certificate would be difficult for an intruder to obtain, whereas obtaining a username and password is quite a bit simpler. There are 4 kinds of token password systems. The first is called a static password token. Your identity is authenticated by the token, and then you are automatically allowed into the system. An example of this would be a swipe card, where you swipe a smart card over an electronic lock to gain access to a room. The second is a synchronous dynamic password token. This token generates new passwords at certain time intervals that are synced up with the main system. The generated password is displayed on the hardware token and it changes from time to time. The password is only valid for a certain period of time. Typing in the wrong password in the wrong time period will invalidate the authentication. RSA Secure ID is an example of this type of system. You type in the code displayed on your RSA Secure ID key fob and your own PIN before you're granted system access. Third is the asynchronous dynamic password token. This token works on the same principle as the synchronous, but in this case, there is no specific time frame. Usually, the password is generated by pressing keys on the token device and the authentication server to advance to the next password value. You enter that, and then you're granted access. The fourth type is a challenge response token, and you're sent a special challenge string at a random or timed intervals. Then you input this challenge string into the hardware token device, and the device responds by generating a challenge response. You type this response into the system, and if it's correct, you're authenticated. This type of system verifies that you have a hardware token device and that you know your own PIN number. In all 4 types, if the token doesn't grant you access to certain information, either that information isn't displayed or your access is denied. The authentication system creates a token every time a session begins. When the session closes, the token is destroyed. A third authentication factor is something that you are. This factor requires the user to provide some unique physical attribute to authenticate to the system, like a fingerprint. This is done using a biometric scanner that evaluates the user's physical attribute. If the attribute scanned matches a predefined value, then the biometric system authenticates the user. You don't have to use a fingerprint. You can use hand geometry, palm scans, retina scans, iris scans, facial recognition, and even your heartbeat signature. Biometrics is considered one of the most secure forms of authentication because it's difficult for a non-authorized user to duplicate physical features. To enroll a user for biometric authentication, first you have to scan an image of the physical attribute so the system can extract its features. Then, when the user wants to authenticate again, the biometric system compares the attribute the user supplied against the sample that was initially provided when the biometric system was first set up. If they match, the user can log in. If they don't, then the user is denied access. You may encounter several types of errors in biometric systems. A type 1 error, known as false rejection, happens when a biometric system determines that a legitimate user is unauthorized. A type 2 error is known as a false acceptance. This happens when a biometric system mistakenly determines that unauthorized users are legitimate and gives them access. You can have a false positive, which indicates that a given condition exists, when in reality it doesn't, and a false negative, which indicates that a given condition does not exist, when in fact it does. Then there's type 4 authentication, somewhere you are. This takes into account where you are accessing the information from, like the IP address of your machine. This information allows only one session to be opened from the same machine at a given moment. And the last authentication factor is type 5, something you do. This takes into account the specific way you do something. For example, signing your name. You have a signature that virtually no one can copy exactly. Your handwriting is unique. The best way to implement authentication is through multi-factor authentication, where you use more than one of the authentication types. The important thing to remember is that using 2 or 3 authentication factors provides a more secure system. Requiring only a username and a password is using just a single form of authentication. Even though 2 pieces of information are required, they are both something that you know. A better way is to require the user to provide a username, a password, and then something else, like a fingerprint. In this situation, the system is much more secure because you're requiring 2 authentication factors. Using 2 methods of authentication is called two-factor authentication. The most common way to do this is using something you know, like a password, and something you have, such as a token. Implementing 3-factor authentication increases system security. For example, you could require a password, a biometric scan, and a smart card. In order to authenticate to the system, the user would have to successfully provide the correct credentials for all 3 authentication categories. For an even higher security environment, consider using 4 different factors, such as biometrics, smart cards, passwords, and the IP address. There are some network authentication protocols and services you should be familiar with. One of them is the Single Sign-On, or SSO. Single sign-on allows you to complete the authentication process once, for example, at a company portal, and then you are given access to multiple applications like company email and CRM using the one set of credentials. A captive portal is a service you may already be familiar with. A captive portal is a web page that pops up when you access public Wi-Fi. This portal usually summarizes the terms you, as a user, need to accept before using the Wi-Fi in coffee shops, shopping malls, schools, and other places that offer public Wi-Fi. This protects the place you're visiting from any criminal activity you may engage in on the internet. Logging is imperative when dealing with authentication. You should log every authentication attempt along with user success and error messages and timestamps. This information can be used for future reference or to detect any unexpected authentication attempt. By logging this information, you will have the opportunity to analyze patterns in real time and proactively stop threats. So to summarize, we discussed the differences between identification and authentication. We talked about authentication factors and the 4 types of security token password systems. We also talked about biometrics, multi-factor authentication, and different network authentication services. And finally, we reviewed the importance of logging and auditing.